Welcome to Paying Attention. This is a regular conversation between me, Peyton Bowman, and my friend Nicholas Gruen. We're here to talk because we are interested in ideas and discussing them without losing ourselves in abstractions. Our method is to pay attention, often to things that are small or overlooked. We're unafraid also to try figuring things out in real time. In this way, we hope to find a fresh approach to contemporary issues. So, Nicholas, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I have proposed to you that we talk about the wash-up of what we talked about last week. And this might sound like I'm obsessed with going through entrails, but I guess it's part of my method, part of this method that that is embodied in your introduction, which is that I mentioned this example of an interview that took place 20 years ago that is famous in Australia, a politician or a person becoming a politician lasting less than 30 seconds in their first political interview and saying, I can't do this. I became newly aware of it. I was reminded of it. It became emblematic of stuff I've been thinking about for years about democracy and organisation and other things. And so it's not that simple. And that has actually led to a number of interviews and a lot of interest from people. But in my own case, it's also gone into the ponder in tray. And over a week, a whole bunch of new associations suggested themselves. And I think they're powerful ways to take that story to illustrate the significance of what's going on in that story.
Yeah.
So that's what I hope we'll be able to talk about today.
Right. So
with my trusty green tea.
Yeah. And so and last week we were talking about Meninga and his story, and this week, when I was thinking about it, I also thought a lot about some of the kind of stories that we cherish as a society, and you see them in a lot of Hollywood movies. You know, this kind of typical Mr. Smith goes to Washington, normal guy, goes and becomes a politician. He speaks truthfully. He represents himself with sincerity. And gets things done on the political sphere, and people love it. And there's tons of movies like this. I think Jim Carrey made some movies like this. I think I've seen some movies from the UK and so forth. And so why doesn't this work? Why don't we get politicians like this? Why can't Meninga just show up and say, hey, I'm not going to campaign this way. I'm not going to draw a lot of attention to myself. I'm not going to talk about how great I am or how great things are. I'm just going to do what everyone wants me to do, and I'm going to do it with sincerity, and I'm not going to talk too much about it.
Yeah, well, maybe one way to explain that would be why don't people in the marketplace just charge a fair price rather than trying to make as much as they can? And the answer is that if they just charge what seems like a fair price, I mean, they can survive. In some markets, they can survive. In other markets, they can't survive. But the people who are responding to the imperatives of the environment they're in are going by a process of Darwinian evolution to do better than the people who behave as we would kind of like them to behave. So another way of thinking about this would be to say that that our ethical senses come from hunter-gatherers, really, from small or from our families or our schools, where we have personal relations with people. And if you're running a country which is over 25 million people in Australia, over 100 million, I think, in Japan, over 300 million in the United States, over 1 billion in China, that's not gonna work. But I suppose to bring it back to politics, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, leaves some stuff out. Did we see a lot of Mr. Smith raising funding? That's hard because the people who give you the money, some of them just will give you the money and others want things. And politics generally, I mean, one of the things I think that politics is, in its essence, is it is the trading off of means and ends all the time. You're useless if you're not building coalitions, and the people that Mr. Smith in Washington built coalitions with, well, they have their price, and so in fact, a lot of political gossip. A lot of you just go to a coffee shop and you talk to someone about what they saw about politics on the TV the night before. There's a lot of this. Well, he should have said that, and the more I've thought about this, the more irritated that makes me, because they're seeing a carefully curated show, not just by the television producers, but by the politicians. And I'm not speaking negatively about either. They're doing their job. They're having to try to, they're trying to achieve certain things. They may not tell you exactly what those are, but they may be honourable, they may not be honourable. We just don't see very much of it. And so if a politician isn't saying what you wanted them to say, well, don't be surprised. They're about a different kind of game.
So what is it about this game that encourages people, or, I mean, why is it that I can't go to Washington and let's take I guess the fundraising is a good question. So you certainly, there are a lot of sincere, earnest people out there, and they maybe lack the ability to build consensus or build, to connect with people in such a way to organize other people to get them to work with you. In that sense, there's a lack of opportunity then to raise money, because obviously you have to be able to bring some people along, and then there's compromises made at that level. But why is it that why do you have to say I'm a great person to do that? Why can't you just be? I've had a successful career. I want to help people, and in that interview with Meninga, he starts off by talking about the work he's done in the community, and it doesn't sound overly boastful. I mean, you could just say, "I did this, and now I want to do this." Where does this, let's say, BS factor have to be brought in?
It's a very good question. I think you and I both think that the answer is somewhere. In other words, there's something systematic here, and I guess it's really I guess you could say that there is a structure in these things of flattery. There is a sense in politics that the people like to get flattered. People in power like to get flattered, and when a voter has a vote, they've got a little bit of power, and they want to get flattered. Now, it's a funny way for me to describe it as flattery, and maybe as we develop the conversation, people will understand something of why I'm saying it's flattery, but it is a sense of aggrandizement, which is I'm going to hold these people to account. Now, there's something fundamentally mistaken about this, because the point of representative politics is that and this is a point made by Edmund Burke, the sort of founder in some senses of conservatism as a political philosophy, is that the member of parliament, the representative, owes to their constituents their judgment ahead of their vote. In other words, if their community wants them to do one thing, but they actually think it is bad policy for that community, that's what they're there for. They're the specialist. They're the person who's in Westminster, in this case, I'm talking about Edmund Burke from the British Isles, born in Ireland, but in the British Parliament. Their job is to be in the belly of the beast, to be of good conscience, which will involve difficult judgments, trading off various ends and means, and to use their judgment. And the voter wants to be in charge, but the voter can't be in charge because the voter's not there at the time that the vote is held and the debate is held and the deals are made and the opportunities and the choices become manifest. So there's a contradiction there, and that contradiction has the quality, which I think we spoke about last week or the week before. We spoke about Socrates and the idea of vanity. Appealing to people's vanity is a huge source of error and of departure from the truth. And as grandiose as that might say to describe some poor person who's going to vote, there is a lot of this idea that they're accountable to us, that we're going to judge everything, rather than to try to judge their character and then say, well, I'll go with their judgment. We don't tend to, that's not an exciting thing to say on the telly, a compelling thing to say on the telly. Compare that to what we think about a jury, which is, well, we don't know whether the guy was guilty or innocent. We weren't there for the 4 days when evidence was held, but that person, I'll trust that person's judgment, particularly since it agrees with most other people chosen at random from the community. A very different relationship, and it's a relationship of trust and respect rather than I'm the boss, I want to be the boss of you.
Yeah, that's interesting. So basically, when people have that opportunity to vote, and they, even in that small way, they want to get something in a sense from that politician that satisfies
well that's the way it is now. You see, there's been a process over the last 2 generations of hollowing out of our politics. But 2 generations ago, something like, I think it was about 5% of the population were in political parties, often, at least 40% on the left and at least 40% on the right, so there's a kind of balance. And those parties would have branch meetings. They'd be partly social, but they'd discuss politics. They would assess characters, and they would say, if Boris Johnson turned up, they'd say, lovely guy, but we're not sending him to Parliament because he's a liar. He's a liar, can't even tell us how many kids he's got. So that was their role. And I just remember hearing this on the BBC, a conservative ex-MP, now a broadcaster called Matthew Parris, wrote a column. I tweeted about it. I could go and find it, in which he said he just sort of despaired of his fellow conservatives because he said, okay, so you're wanting to get into government. I get that. But Boris, the guy is completely disreputable. So the idea now, Boris wouldn't have got through that ruck, I don't think, 2 generations ago. So the whole way we think about politics now is we're encouraged to think about we are encouraged to think as voters rather like a customer in a shop who's pretty unhappy with these shoddy goods. It's just that those goods are shoddy because we keep buying them. Yeah. In our choices, we choose flatterers. Yeah. And so we get flatterers, and then we're very unhappy with them.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah. I mean, I think that is that desire to see. Well, do you think it's to see yourself in the politician? So, I mean, obviously, if you have, let's say, a dim view of identity politics and don't see, let's say, the good side of it, but you see someone who looks like you or has the same gender as you or something like this, and so you see a little bit of yourself in that person.
Yeah.
And so that in a way is it? But is there, someone like Boris Johnson? I mean, he's kind of funny. He's a very good writer, in my opinion. At least I've read some things he's written that were quite good,
Right.
quite engaging. I don't know if that good. If you determine good by I don't know, something like virtue or something, I don't know if it's there. But
Yeah.
right. So those things don't necessarily reflect me as the voter, but what is it about him that would make someone feel flattered to vote for him?
Well, I think now, this is a rather radical view of mine, but I actually think that that politics, I mean, there's a lot going on inside our heads that isn't acknowledged. There's a lot of subconscious activity, and politics is really remarkably like a reality TV show. So I genuinely think that a certain percentage of the vote for people like Boris Johnson and Donald Trump is, gee, this will be fun. I don't know what proportion that is, but then that would then morph into a much larger class of people who are reacting to some of the statements that are being made. And, what is one of the most terrible things you can say about a leader? That they're boring. I've never understood that.
Yeah.
I've never understood. Sorry, what? Stop the conversation right there. Why do we care whether they're boring? It's not entertainment.
Yeah.
So we've been kind of lulled into a particular way to comprehend what this is and to understand the game, if you like, of politics. And I think we are just deeply alienated from ourselves and our own interests and so on. And let me just give you a quick factoid, which is I defy you, Peyton, to name, I certainly can't name, the Swiss Prime Minister. Now, one pretty important reason why you can't name the Swiss Prime Minister? Because there's a council of 7 and they rotate the prime ministership every year. So he's not, so if that's not giving you the idea that this isn't a kind of trip for egomaniacs, I'd like to know what is.
Yeah.
This is an idea that we need. In fact, again, it's a conservative idea that we need government that, Warren Buffett is known for saying, which I don't think he said, but it's a great saying, which is, I only invest in companies that could be run by an idiot because one day they will be. And likewise, this is there's great wisdom in this, which is that and the American founding fathers believed in checks and balances and all this sort of stuff, and you divide up power. But this idea of just rotating the prime ministership between 7 competent people, previously qualified as competent, seems an awfully it's just a nice thought experiment, put it that way. And it's not just a thought experiment; it's a real one.
But
and it puts things in a very different light.
And it's interesting too if you choose leaders who are, let's say, if you choose them based on how fun they are or something along these lines, you have to find an alternative means of justifying your vote. Like, you can't just say, I liked Donald Trump because he was funny, right? You have to come up, and then there's a kind of mental gymnastics that comes into play to make it, to allow you to, let's say, speak in a way that the system, in a sense, demands, that, for example, you're supposed to talk about a president in a certain way, or you're supposed to talk about a leader in a certain way. Yeah. And so then you have to somehow connect these two disparate thoughts.
Yeah, but this was one of Trump's great assets, and I would say there's very, very, very little about Trump that I like. I regard him as a awful, really an odious character. I did like this, that there's a nice aphorism, I don't think I'll get it right, but it was that he the public understood that he he lied. A lot of the facts that came out of his mouth weren't facts that were not true, but there was a truthfulness in his manner. And he was not scripted. And he was quite prepared to say things that were not calculated to advantage him particularly. He was in the mood to say this or that. He'd talk to a rally and say, I had a bit of a bad night last night. Oh, well, I'll just keep going, this sort of stuff. It was not calculated. And that then comes over as it should, as an absolute breath of fresh air. That is, in fact, he's actually channeling a little bit of Mr. Smith Comes to Washington, believe it or not. It's quite a powerful kernel of Mr. Smith, the billionaire, comes to Washington. It's just changed around the edges, but it has some of that. It has some of that. He can tap into that zeitgeist.
Well, he somehow presents it. I think it's a good question how much of this has been figured out ahead of time, but.
I don't think it has. I don't think it's been figured out ahead of time. He's a very intuitive guy. And lots of amateurs in politics think, just leave it to me. I know how this game works. And most of them don't have the foggiest clue. Yeah. But he knows about reality TV. He knows about wrestling and kayfabe and all these things. And I was barracking for Hillary, not with any great enthusiasm, but then I was quite thrilled that Donald Trump was the candidate, because I thought he will make so many just sort of terrible mistakes, like he spends weeks worrying about the Gold Star family that he shockingly abused, and John saying that a war hero is a sucker. These were awful. Anyway, it didn't matter. It didn't matter.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people thought at the beginning.
Yeah, I was wrong. I was wrong.
So, to get kind of back to our topic, in another episode, we talked a little bit about there was a civil servant who you described, and a kind of confession that he made about his work, and how he was supposed to be doing a certain thing, but that he created a lot of different documents, reports, and acted as if he was carrying out his duties in a responsible way, but it was all completely false. It was all made up. And so it kind of, the reason why it kind of came to my mind is because we're discussing how we expect a politician to behave in a certain way, and how, someone who is a truly honest person, or at least seems to be an honest person or sincere, earnest person, can't play this game. That in a way, it's the same game that the civil servant.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about how those.
So I wrote this. So this came to me when I was speaking to a Boston consulting outfit called the Center for Public Impact, which is a sort of pro bono effort and looks at social questions. And we had an hour-long meeting talking about something I'd written about why all kinds of incredibly promising initiatives just don't go anywhere in government. And they said, well, you'd be interested in this anonymously published piece that we put on our website. So I'll read you the opening of that article. I spent 10 years of my life writing. I wrote neighbourhood plans, partnership strategies, the local area agreement stretch targets, the sustainable community strategy, monitoring documents, the council plan and service plans. I have a confession to make. Much of it was made up. It was fudged, spun, copied and pasted, cobbled together and attractively formatted. I told lies in themes, lies in groups, lies in pairs, strategic lies, operational lies, cross-cutting lies. I wrote hundreds of pages of nonsense. Some of it was my own, but most of it was collated from my colleagues across the organisation and brought together into a single document, and attractively formatted single document. Why did I do it? I did it because it was my job. Now, almost everyone I talk to can recognise that, and they don't even have to have worked in a bureaucracy. Any student who's gone for a scholarship will recognise the falsification that is now built in. And the mechanisms that we're talking about here, Peyton, are the same kinds of mechanisms that Meninga was resisting and that the public want, which is, you want my vote, I want you to tell me how great you will be for me. And in this case, I'm a senior manager, I'm accountable to the people. We've got a politician who said he's going to do all these things. So we're now going to build a bureaucracy that will, as it manages programs, will send, and it will try and deal with problems, but there will be many times when it won't be very candid about those problems, because it will be time to market these. It will be the honeyed words will be necessary. A guy called Bill Easterly, William Easterly, a development economist, talks about the cartel of good intentions, which is the same thing, which is that bad news about what's not working simply can't get out because everyone says, oh, you mustn't do that because everyone will be upset. Politicians will lose elections, we'll lose donations, and so on. So that in all of these situations, what's common to them is the thing that Meninga was pushing back on. And as I've thought about it throughout this week, I've realised that comes from a deep place in human experience and is not just, there's nothing true. I can't speak for Meninga, but I don't think there's anything trivial about that story. It's funny. I think it's very funny. But it's a deep, it allows us to address this incredible situation. I mean, this is what I just read you this is how most of our organisations work, and certainly government organisations, and certainly the UN, and certainly this is this is terrible. This matters. Yeah. It matters for productivity. It matters for whether we get, how many wars we get, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, and there's a sense, in a way, that this bureaucracy is insisting on being flattered, on flattering itself. I mean, what's more flattering to a bureaucracy than nicely formatted, Microsoft Word documents or something along these lines? And,
exactly.
So, I think there's that connection to the vanity, not just of an individual, but of an organization or of a social body or something along these lines.
And the more I thought about this, the other thing that came into my mind from my school days was King Lear. And I've just spent the last hour reading the opening scene of King Lear again, noticing all these things. Now, what happens in King Lear is that the great king, a great aging king, calls his minions and his daughters together. There are 3 daughters. And he says, well, I'm now going to abdicate the throne, and I'm going to break up my estate into 3. And he then holds an auction. And the auction is an auction for love. Is this sounding promising to you, Peyton? And he says, words to the effect of, the party that most convinces me of their love will get the best bit of the estate. Now, this is what he's going to get nicely attracted, nicely formatted lies. Yeah. He's insisting on lies. And there are 3 daughters, and the first 2, the older 2, flatter him in the words of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli of Great Britain, when it comes to flattery, lay it on with a trowel, he said about talking to Queen Victoria. And boy, do they lay it on. And then Cordelia, whom he loves the most and who is, it turns out, well, I won't, we can get onto that would otherwise be a spoiler, but they're a love match. He's always been, deeply fond of her, and she likewise, and she's silent. She can't prove her love. She can't auction. She will not participate in this auction. She's, if I might trivialize the grandness of Shakespeare, she's Mal Meninga for the moment. She's saying, I can't do this bullshit. I'm not going to do it. But she says she loves him. She says she loves him as a daughter loves a father. And so the drama of the play is about flattery, about love, about the conditions for love to flourish, the conditions for love to die, and about the truth and the relationship between those things.
Yeah.
And the more, and so this is just a very deep, that's what I meant by Mal Meninga's little episode, conjuring the depths. This is a big deal. What's going, this is a big story, not just a nice joke.
No, yeah, and King Lear doesn't exactly have a happy ending either. Perhaps, I guess you could debate whether this or maybe Hamlet is the darker of the two, but I think it has the maybe the darkest ending among Shakespeare's tragedies.
Yeah. Well, it's the darkest. It's the deepest, darkest story. The ending is just pure pathos and also cleansing fire. The truth, you've got love and you've got truth, and they are separated, blown asunder by this madness of this king who says, prove to me how much you love me and I'll reward you for it. I mean, that's a category mistake. That's, I guess, what I'm saying about the voters. They're making a category mistake. And so love and truth are torn asunder, and the people who are part of this story are consumed in the fire, and at the end, love and truth are reunited, and the main human bearers of this story are consumed in the fire.
And what was it? The ending is something like, if I remember this quote correctly, I'm not looking at this, but what is it? The weight of these sad times we must obey, speak what we feel and not what we ought to say. I think that's the end of the... I think
that, well, yes, I think there's another famous ending. I don't even know if it's this one. Yeah, no. I've got it here because I quoted this in a very different context. Right. Yeah, so the weight of this sad time we must, Edgar says, the weight of this sad time we must obey, speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest hath borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long. That's it. And, excuse me. I don't know why should that be so moving? But anyway, I found it very moving.
But yeah, it's, I mean, I think it gets to the heart of so much. We in a way, it's kind of funny to laugh about whether it's Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or these different actors in politics or Mal Meninga, but this all really has a real human and
meaningful
to all of us.
Yeah, you see, so I read those words for the first time in 5 years or so when I just read them to you, and though that second line is just jumps out. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. But you said before we started the recording, well, Cordelia seems very formal in her love, and I was saying, and I'm not saying I was right, but I was saying I had always read that. So Cordelia, when she's asked to say how much she loves her father, to her father, she says, I love you as my bond, I think, or something like that. I love you as a daughter loves a father. I love you no less. I love you no more.
Yeah.
And he's completely incensed. But that would, and you argued that that's very Aristotelian, a sort of duty-based notion of love, and maybe that's right. And I thought, yes, it's a duty-based expression of love, but that's because the sentimental expression of love has been made impossible by the way in which Lear has set up the situation.
Yeah.
And sure enough, and what I was worried about is that this is the early 17th century, so are people going to be that much into feelings? And the answer is yes, because in the third last line, the morals speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. But anyway, speak the and also, if you're in a bureaucracy, wouldn't it be good if you spoke the truth, not what you ought to say? And the answer is you won't get anywhere, and you'll be sharpening pencils if you do that without a certain eye for, I'm not telling people never tell the truth, but you have to do it in the way of the courtier. You have to do it in the culture of the court, and that's certainly not for just unalloyed truth telling.
Yeah. Well, that's
and more fool us for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Well, that's an interesting. So when
well, hang on. Let me interrupt, and then you can go on with that. But that's now I get my answer to about Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Mr. Smith tells the truth in a bureaucracy and goes nowhere. Yeah. There are acculturated, institutionalized norms and rules of behavior in these systems that honor the institutional imperatives, and it's fantasy to imagine that you just ignore those things, but then we still have to return back to them and say, well, what could we do? What changes could we make in our political system that would allow the Meningas, the Cordelias, the Socrates to be heard? Yeah. But you go on with the point you were going to make.
Well, I was thinking a little bit about this idea that, in an institutional context, is there a way in which, it's easy, let's say, to counterfeit true affection in this way that Lear's older daughters do.
Yeah.
But there's a quote, and it's somewhere from a long time ago when I read Remembrance of Things Past. So it's somewhere in those, 1,000, 2,000 pages, but and I can't remember exactly, but he's talking about one of Proust is the narrator of this story is talking about one of these women he's encountered in this kind of social scene, in this aristocratic social scene, and she's extremely formal. But at the same time, he talks about how, people who met her didn't quite, their first thought was that she was insincere, but in fact, she actually had this true affection that that she could sort of channel through this like traditional formal structure of like aristocratic norms and behaviors.
Yeah.
And, I think this is actually a major theme of a lot of works about sort of pre-modern aristocracies, because I also think a little bit about the tale of Genji, in which Genji has this real kind of, he follows all the manners and customs to, perfection, basically. He does some scandalous stuff, but it's always driven by this real kind of, let's say, erotic power that drives his love for different, women around the court. And then his son, who's never given a name as far as I know in that story, except Genji's son, sort of tries to imitate his father, and he can't do it. He doesn't really have that. He imitates the outward form, but doesn't have that internal, there's sort of the book is a little bit about how that sort of power has declined across generations and so forth. But
yeah.
So I do wonder, so this is an interesting question. How could someone, let's say, exist in an institutional setting and yet do so in a way that kind of really channels some sort of powerful sense of passion or desire to do good in the world. And maybe this is a discussion for another day, but I do think one of the concepts you've talked about is accountability, and how in a deliberative body, people actually are sort of freed, in a jury, for example, they're freed in a way from that sense of accountability, right? So they're free to make a decision of their own, but they're working within some kind of institutionalized or some sort of kind of corporate or consensus building approach to solving problems.
Yeah. So again, just as you speak, I'm making a new connection, as it were, because the current way we think about politics, political accountability, how do we make a democracy, which is that the politicians are accountable to us. And how's that going then? Well, they are accountable to us. If they engineer a massive famine in a democracy, they're likely to be voted out of office. So there's some degree of accountability. But the accountability is only once every time someone has to vote. The accountability is through the average of 9 seconds of sound bites of a president on the US television, of less than that on social media. The accountability is via sort of lists of the way in which Congress people have voted, even though, and that's that will be framed in and weaponized, and you won't be presented with that information in a way that helps you really judge it. And if you would, and that's because if you were presented with enough information to judge it better, it would take you too long and you wouldn't read it or you wouldn't listen to it. So so there are all kinds of ways in which accountability is, in the words of James Burnham, a kind of wish fulfillment theory of politics. I'm not suggesting throwing it out. I am suggesting demoting it on our hierarchy of wonderful things. And the beauty of what happens on a jury is that the jurors are not formally accountable to anyone other than themselves. And isn't that a nice analogy with Cordelia? Because Cordelia was being made accountable for the love she had for her father, and that was inhuman for someone with such integrity, such honor, such respect for the truth. That violated her sense of the truth and made it impossible. And likewise on a jury, people almost invariably do take it very seriously, and they do their best. Some won't. But there's, on a legal jury, there are 12 people, and, 10, 11 or 12 of those will be really doing their best. And so they're accountable to themselves. And that's human freedom. That's like Cordelia's freedom to love or not to love, that if we really want what they think, if we really want to honor that, we have to create a situation. So I don't want to sort of say people behave better when they're not accountable. We know that that's not true. But it is not beyond the wit of humanity to create institutions which appeal to the better angels of our nature, to quote a famous countryman of yours. And that is, I think that's a sublime mission, and there's plenty of work to be done and plenty of promise, it seems to me. Just look at a jury and look at how well people react to a jury when they're exposed to this. And I'm thinking particularly of citizen juries, that is, juries of everyday people selected at random, asked to solve a problem. They come out of those juries really, almost all of them, so 95% of them feel good about it. Half of those feel very good about it. Half of those sort of express sentiments about how their life has changed, or not so much that, but why can't life be like this? Why can't politics be like this? This is like falling off a log. We really should be able to do this on so many more things. And about half of those go and stand for their local for office at the next opportunity. An incredible source of promise, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, I like that. It sounds a bit more promising than the end of King Lear, that's for sure. So I think maybe it's a good.
Well, that's our choice. That's our choice, to come through the fire, to be made more whole, and whether we're going to be there as human beings enjoying that or whether we are consumed. That's the choice.
Well, sounds good. Well, I think that is a really good place for us to pause our conversation, but I look forward to continuing this with you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Peyton. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
All right.